Okay, congratulations. Welcome to the last chapter of the course where we're going to be working with APIs for the first time. So what is an API? Well, an API stands for an Application Programming Interface. And you're saying, okay, that's great. I now know what an API stands for, but what is it? Well, what we can do when we are creating applications sometimes is send a request somewhere else to get data, okay? And then we get that data back. So for example, you might make a weather app whereby you send a request to get data from an API somewhere, and it might send back whether it is raining or not in Houston, Texas. Okay, that is an example of a request being sent to an API and a response being sent back. If you were to ever make a YouTube clone, maybe with a front-end framework such as React, you might also have to send a request to an API, maybe for example the YouTube API, and get the videos back in the form of JSON. So in this chapter of the course, we're going to learn about GET requests, how to send a request to an API, the data format that it comes back in. But first, we have to understand the difference between asynchronous and synchronous JavaScript. So what we've covered in this course so far is synchronous JavaScript. That is the idea that things happen one at a time. So JavaScript is a synchronous programming language whereby tasks or operations are executed one line after the other in a sequential manner. So we saw this, for example, when we were logging out things to the console. If we were to run this code, we would have the statement, I'm the first line of code execute, followed by I am the second line of code, followed by the third line of code, okay? One of the downfalls or disadvantages of synchronous code is that if there is a mistake somewhere, one line of code can block the rest of the operation from running. We saw that whenever we had a typo, for example, if I was trying to access a variable that didn't work, the whole script file essentially would just stop working, okay? So synchronous is the whole idea that tasks are executed one at a time. So for example, building a house, maybe you need to chop down the tree, I need to turn it into limber, and then our friend actually, puts the timber onto the roof. That would be basically an example of a synchronous operation where you have to chop down the tree, I have to wait for you before I can, make the timber bars, and then our friend has to wait for me to provide them with the timber or the lumber in a certain way for them to use the nails and hammer it onto the roof of a house. Okay, so it is synchronous. Asynchronous JavaScript is the idea that code can take some time to run, but typically what it means is that multiple tasks can happen at the same time. So for example, in the real world, making a Big Mac, believe it or not, can be an example of asynchronous because one person might be toasting the buns at one time while simultaneously someone is cooking the meat. Then of course the buns are handed to the person who dresses them, but you might have a situation where while the burger is cooking, we're actually toasting the buns and doing the dressing then. Okay, so that's two tasks happening at the same time. So that is the idea behind asynchronous. It's the idea that multiple things can be happening at the same time, so not necessarily in a sequential manner. So for example, you might be making an application and the first statement is executed. Then we move on to the second statement, statement 2, but maybe that is a piece of code that sends a request to an API and we're waiting to get data back. So if we write our code in an asynchronous manner, what happens is instead of waiting for us to get a response from the API to then go on and do the third task, we make our code so that, okay, while we're waiting for a response for statement 2, let's go on and do the third task, okay? So this is the whole idea behind asynchronous JavaScript. It's basically non-blocking. If you're sending a request to an API to do something, you don't need to wait for a response before doing something else. You can continue to execute operations in your JavaScript file. So the benefits of asynchronous JavaScript is that we can start running some code, but I'll have to wait for it to finish before going on to do something else. Like I just said, maybe you're sending a request to an API to get back, a song or a video, but while you're waiting for that, you're doing something else, okay? And it is the whole idea that the execution of tasks in JavaScript or statements are not dependent on each other. So this conceptually doesn't make a whole lot of sense until we actually see the code. Key point about this part of the course, we're going to start working with APIs. We're going to learn what JSON is, GET requests. So just one key takeaway from this tutorial, try to understand the difference between synchronous and asynchronous JavaScript. Synchronous is the idea that tasks are executed one after the other. Task 1, then task 2, then task 3. If there is a mistake or an error somewhere, task 3 cannot happen until task 2 executes. Task 2 cannot happen until we've completed task 1. Asynchronous JavaScript is different. It is the idea that we can perform multiple operations simultaneously or at the same time, so they're not necessarily executed in a sequential manner. We might do task 1, then we start task 2. Task 2 is currently ongoing while we're waiting for a response, but we don't wait for a response to go on and execute task 3. So that is the key difference between synchronous and asynchronous JavaScript. Synchronous JavaScript is what we've seen so far in this course. Tasks are executed one after the other. Things happen one at a time in a sequential manner. But with asynchronous, multiple tasks can happen at once. Okay, so for example, I don't know if anyone's seen Loki on Disney Plus, but me and you in our lives, that's all happened in a sequential way, I suppose you could say. You might do one thing and then do something else and then do something else, where with the multiverse theory, there are potentially multiple things happening at the same time. Also, even in our current timeline, if I went down and made a cup of tea, maybe I'm waiting for the kettle to boil, but I'm also cooking beans at the same time. That would be me performing asynchronous tasks, basically doing two tasks at the same time, not waiting for one to finish before doing the other. But conceptually, it's hard to really get a grasp of this until we actually see it in action. So I'm going to end the tutorial there, and I'll see you in the next one. We need to understand the difference, of course, between synchronous and asynchronous and what they are for us to work with APIs. Okay, awesome. See you in the next one. Okay, so in this tutorial, we're just going to speak in a little bit of detail about APIs, what they are, and just some basic terminology I want you to be aware of or to understand before we actually start writing code to talk to an API. Okay? So first of all, what is an API? Well, as I said, an API stands for an Application Programming Interface. You can send a request to an API and get data back. So an API almost is like a server somewhere. It is a server on a computer over the internet, and you can speak to an API to get data back. So as I say, we can talk to APIs and get back data. This data typically comes in the form of something known as JSON, okay? So JSON stands for JavaScript Object Notation. That's not really important. What matters is that you understand it is a format, and JSON is an easy to read format. So you can talk to APIs that already exist. So for example, there are weather APIs where you can get the weather, as I say, weather conditions in Florida, Texas, maybe Calgary. You can actually get the latest Bitcoin price if you want to speak to a Bitcoin API. You can even make your own API if you know a server-side language such as Node.js. So the key point is that an API is a server somewhere. You can talk to it, basically say to the API, hey, I want to get data. You can get data for Bitcoin, for stock prices, for weather, okay? So it allows you to make really cool applications. So here are two examples of an API endpoint. So I've said to you, you can speak to an API. APIs will have different endpoints, okay? So for example, there's one API called catfact.ninja/fact, where you can actually just get a random fact about a cat, okay? There's also a Bitcoin API where you can get the Bitcoin price, the latest price for Bitcoin, if you hit that Bitcoin API endpoint, okay? So just to recap, an API stands for an Application Programming Interface, and you can talk to an API to get back data. The data will typically come back to you in the form of JSON. JSON stands for JavaScript Object Notation. It's just a formatted data, and APIs will have endpoints. They're the endpoints that I often use the term we speak to, okay? When I say we speak to, we're basically writing code to send a request to the API to get data back. And then, like I say, what is JSON? Well, JSON is the format of the response we typically get nowadays. Most APIs will send back a response in the form of JSON. most but not all. So as we've said, JSON stands for JavaScript Object Notation, and really it's basically a string of data that looks like an object or an array of objects. It's not really, but it looks like it, and it's very easy to work with and easy for the human eye to read, okay? So that is what an API is. We speak to an API to get data. It comes back in the form of JSON. Okay, awesome. I'll see you in the next tutorial. Okay, so this is a visual representation of what talking to an API looks like. Now, I like to use the term talking to an API, but if we're trying to get data back from an API, when I say talking to an API, what I really mean is we are sending a GET request to an API, and then we're getting some form of response. So if everything works, we're over here, we're building our website. Maybe we're building a weather app, for example, or a YouTube clone. So this will be our application. What we do is we can send a request to the API to get data. So this is our website, our application, also known as the client. And what we're doing is we're sending a request to some sort of data source or server, okay? Maybe we're hitting the Bitcoin API. There's lots of them, but you know, a particular Bitcoin API, some sort of endpoint. So if everything works correctly, if you have a good internet connection, you don't make any typos, and the API is working and operational, what will happen is you will send a request to the API to get data, and the API will send the data back. So we're almost ready now to start writing up some actual code to talk to an API. So as I say, we are the application or the client. We're sending a request to get data back from an API or server, and if everything works, it'll send back the data. Key points to note: when we send a request to an API and we're trying to get data, this is known as a GET request, and most APIs now will respond with a format known as JSON, okay? So remember, an API, we know it stands for Application Programming Interface. It's really just a server somewhere on a computer over the internet, and you can get data back. You can get the latest price for Bitcoin. You can find out if it's raining in Vancouver. You know, what are the weather conditions like in Florida or Sydney, Australia, or whatever the case may be, okay? So hopefully now over the last few tutorials, you understand what asynchronous for synchronous programming is. You understand that an API is basically a server out there where we can get back data, okay? So this is just a quick overview of that. We'll start writing some code now in a couple of tutorials, but just want you to conceptually understand an API is basically something you can talk to get data back, but you obviously have to write the code to talk to an API. So that is what we'll be covering now over the next few tutorials. Okay, so we're just going to talk briefly about fetch before we actually start writing code. So we're going to be writing out code where we make a GET request to an API and get data back. And to do that, we will be using what is known as the fetch API. So fetch is inbuilt into JavaScript, and it essentially is a new and modern way that allows us to make HTTP requests over the internet or the World Wide Web to get data. So what we're going to do is we're going to be using the fetch API to essentially fetch data, okay? So when you're working with the fetch API, we're just going to call it fetch, like Mean Girls, fetch. Anyway, the fetch API will expect to receive some sort of URL, okay? And this URL will be the URL or the API endpoint that we are trying to talk to or get data from. So in a previous tutorial, I actually showed you an endpoint that you can use to get random cat data and even to get the latest Bitcoin price, okay? So we're going to have to understand various things as well, such as promises, etc. But when we get a response back from an API, we're going to get a response that is known as a promise, okay? So if everything works out, the promise will eventually resolve to a response object, i.e. the data we need. What we can then do is use .then to essentially see the data or catch, if we need to catch an error, okay? So speaking to an API, there's a few different steps you have to go through. It's not just as simple as writing fetch, pasting in a URL, and then you get the data back in the format that you want. We're going to have to speak a bit about promises and then using a method known as .json. Just a quick point to note, Internet Explorer does not support the use of the fetch API. At least that was the case last time I checked. So I'll be using Google Chrome. And then at a very basic level, this is a very basic example of a fetch request. We are going to use fetch to basically send a request to get a random cat fact back. Then what we're going to do is chain on the .then method. We will call the response, we get back the response, and then we're just going to log it out to the console to see what we get. Okay, so we've covered now over the last few tutorials, we've done a lot of theory. We've spoke about what an API is. We know an API is basically a server somewhere, and we can send a GET request to get data back. I've now told you we're going to use the fetch API to send that request. We can hit or speak to an API endpoint to get data back, and that will come in the form of JSON. So we've covered now the basics of what an API is in theory. The last few tutorials are very much theory focused. So the next few tutorials now we're going to actually start writing some code. We have quite a bit to learn, so I'm looking forward to being on that journey with you. So I'll see you in the next tutorial. Okay, so in the next tutorial is where we're going to start having fun. We will be writing our first fetch or first GET request in the next tutorial. For this tutorial, what I want to do is just do a very basic example using the console to show you the difference between synchronous code or JavaScript and asynchronous. So really everything we've seen so far in this course is synchronous. It is essentially code that executes in a sequential manner. One thing happens at a time. So for example, if I just log out to the console, you know, Bruce Wayne is awesome, okay? And then maybe if I just log out then afterwards, you know, console.log, I also love Superman. And then maybe we'll just say, you know, console.log. Sorry, man, I keep missing keys. Robin is cool too, okay? So we know what's going to happen. We've seen this before. So this is synchronous JavaScript. Our JavaScript file is going to load, the browser's going to run it, and it's just going to go console.log, Bruce Wayne is awesome. Then it's going to say, I also love Superman. And then it's going to say, Robin is cool too. So these three statements, these three console logs are happening one at a time, one after the other. We execute this one, then that one, and then this one. Just for the sake of it, I'll just refresh the browser and just show you that. Okay, so you see here it happens in order. So that is an example of synchronous JavaScript. Okay, now what I want to do is I want to change this code to make it asynchronous. So now we're going to do an example of asynchronous. So what I'm going to do is let's just change that to be asynchronous. Okay, now what I'm going to do is in between Bruce Wayne is awesome and I also love Superman, I'm going to use what's known as the set timeout method. So the set timeout method is another method inbuilt in JavaScript, and what it does is you can essentially delay the execution of code. So I could just log out to the console, you know, Wonder Woman is the best, but use the set timeout method to delay it by, let's say, 5 seconds. So if I say set timeout, note the use of camel case there. So it is an inbuilt method in JavaScript. So to call or invoke it, we have parentheses. And we actually need to pass in a callback function to it. So we're just going to have an arrow function here, okay, like so. And then what I'm going to do is just inside of the set timeout, we're going to write our code. We're just going to say console.log, Wonder Woman is the best, okay? And then in here, okay, what we can do is just use the amount of milliseconds that we want to delay the code. So I'm just going to tell you in advance what's going to happen. What's going to happen is as follows, because this is asynchronous code. JavaScript is going to see this statement and it's going to say, okay, fine, I will log out Bruce Wayne is awesome to the console. Then it's going to see the set timeout and it's going to say, okay, I would need to log out Wonder Woman is the best, but whoever wrote the code here wants me to wait 5 seconds. So rather than waiting, okay, rather than waiting for this to execute before continuing to execute statements in a file, JavaScript is going to come back to that. So it's going to actually log out I love Superman, I also love Superman, and then Robin is cool too before logging out to the console Wonder Woman is the best. So that's actually an example of asynchronous JavaScript where it executes this line, then it says, okay, I need to do something, but we're not going to stay here and wait for it to finish before we continue on executing statements in the JavaScript file. No, no. What we're going to do is continue on executing. So this is a very basic example of asynchronous JavaScript. I just want you to see it in action before we work with fetch in the next tutorial. So we see here, Bruce is awesome, we love Superman, Robin is cool too. Then we wait, and see, we get Wonder Woman is the best. There was a delay. So the cool thing is that, you know, the Wonder Woman, that piece of code, that was actually written ahead of, you know, I also love Superman and Robin is cool too, and yet they were logged out, the messages about them to the console first, okay? So that was a very basic example of asynchronous code in action, the idea that multiple things are happening at once, whereby we execute this, JavaScript says, okay, I need to run this code, but rather than waiting for it, I'll continue executing these statements underneath while this is running in the background. Because yeah, okay, awesome. So guys, that is a very basic example of asynchronous JavaScript in action. We're going to start seeing some cool stuff now in the next 2 tutorials. We'll work with fetch and actually get back data from an API. I feel I've been talking about APIs the whole course and getting back data, so we're going to actually be able to do it, which is pretty cool. So key takeaway, synchronous JavaScript is code that executes, you know, essentially line by line, one thing at a time in a sequential manner. Asynchronous JavaScript is different. It is the idea that our code is non-blocking. You know, we're not going to sit here and wait for this timeout method to run before executing out, you know, I love Superman or Robin is cool too, okay? So get a cup of tea or coffee, see you in the next tutorial. We're going to see fetch for the first time, so that's going to be great. Okay, welcome back. So in this tutorial, we're actually going to make a GET request to an API. I apologize, over the last few tutorials, we've done a lot of theory. Technically, there is more theory we could do because we need to speak a bit about what a promise is, but I don't want to keep just talking about, you know, what is an API, what is JSON, what's a promise, all of these things. I'd like us to actually just start writing the code now, just so you can see it. So what I did was, I just Googled free APIs, and I'm at this URL here. So we have this website. It looks like it's API Fini, I think. I hope I pronounced that correctly. But basically, it is a huge list of free or public APIs that we can use for testing. So this is us just learning how to make a GET request to an API for the first time. And crucially, we don't need to use an API key, okay? So I scroll down and there's 2 APIs I like here. So there's this one called cat facts. You just get a random cat fact, okay? So basically, this is the URL endpoint that we're going to have to hit or talk to, as I often say. And some people would say perhaps a more useful one would be you could make a GET request to the Bitcoin API, okay? So feel free in your own time to have a look through those various APIs, okay? So what I've done is inside of Visual Studio Code, I'm after just writing out some notes and I'm going to talk you through it. So in this tutorial, as I say, we're going to be writing our first GET request. Remember, a GET request is we're looking to get data from another source, you know, a server somewhere, like we say. And what's going to happen is when we make our GET request using fetch, we're going to be returned a promise, okay? Now, a promise initially is in the pending state, right? And then eventually what happens is the promise either resolves or it rejects. So if a promise resolves, it means that everything has worked. You know, we had a good internet connection, the API was working, it wasn't down, and our code was good, okay? Basically, if you meet all of the right conditions, if you send a GET request to an API, you return a promise, and eventually that promise will resolve. And if it is fulfilled, you then have access to the data that it sent back. A promise can reject, of course, as well, if something has gone wrong. But assuming everything works, these are the steps we're going to follow. So the first thing you need to do is decide, you know, what API it is you want to talk to. So for example, do you want to get random cat data or do you want to get the Bitcoin price? So I've chosen to start off, we're going to get cat facts. So I've chosen the API, and this is it says here, sample API URL. So this is the URL or the endpoint we're going to use to make a request. So we're going to be requesting data from this endpoint, okay, or that API. So then what you do is once you've decided on your API and the endpoint or the URL, which I just showed you there, what you do is you write down the keyword fetch, okay? So see here, I've written fetch. Then you have parentheses, and inside of the parentheses, you just paste in the URL. So you notice there, I have an opening and closing quote. So therefore we fetch parentheses, and inside of quotes, we pass in our API endpoint. okay? Then what we need to do is chain on dot then. So we've seen method chaining before. We make our request, and then what we can do is use dot then, and basically we can log out the response to the console. Now, when you see the response, it's going to be in the form of JavaScript object notation or JSON. Not JSON, the person, hi Jason, but actually JSON. So not JSON, JSON, okay? Now the problem with JSON, well JSON's great by the way, it really is, it's very easy to read, but it's not actually a JavaScript object. It kind of looks like a JavaScript object, but it's actually not. So then what you need to do if everything works is you need to just add on another dot then, okay? And essentially, when you get your response, you call or invoke the .json method. Only then will you be able to then actually log out the data to the console. So just to recap, we use the fetch keyword, we have our parentheses. Once we've decided on our API endpoint, you paste that in. You can then chain on a dot then just to log out the response object to the console. But as I say, it's not actually a JavaScript object. It's actually in the form of JSON once the promise resolves. So then what we're going to do this piece of code first, just so I can show you it. But then what we want to do is actually use the JSON method to basically parse or get the data back in the form of a JavaScript object, and then we can just log it out to the console. So then what we're going to do, this will be the first thing we're going to do together, but then we're going to write this piece of code where what we're going to do is we're going to use the fetch keyword again. We have our parentheses, paste in our URL endpoint for the cat facts, chain on a dot then, and on our response, what we're going to do is we're going to then, on that response, chain on a .json method to return the JSON response to a JavaScript object, and then we'll chain on another dot then, and then with the data we now have in a JavaScript object, we can then just log that out to the console. Okay, I'm going to try and make this tutorial as short and as concise as possible, and in the next tutorial we'll have a look at this again. Just want to slowly take your hand now and introduce you to these concepts. Okay, so let's actually do that. So what I'm going to do is just refresh the console, so we see there's nothing there. So let's actually write out the code together. So as I say, you use the keyword fetch, okay? We have our parentheses, and then what we need to do is paste in the URL, okay? So I'm going to paste in the URL for catfax. Just paste that in there. So now we've made the request, okay? But then what we need to do is we need to, of course, check to see what the response is. So what I can do is I can use or chain on dot then, okay? Dot then is a method, so it has parentheses. And then what I'm going to do is we're going to just pass in here a function, and what the function is going to do is just return a response to us. And then I just want to log out the response, okay? So let's just log out the response that we get. Okay, awesome. Let me just save and refresh. Okay, so what we've done is we've actually got a response, okay? But what you'll notice is we see here, it says it's of type response. We have the URL. We have all these things called cores and status 200, so headers. So what you'll notice is it is a response, okay? But like, it's not very useful, is it? So the good thing is we have a status 200, which means that everything has worked, but we have not actually got back what we wanted, okay? So in the sense that we don't actually see any cat data. And that is because what I spoke to you about a moment ago. You get a response, okay, but what you then need to do with the response is instead of logging out to the console using .then, you need to use the .json method to parse the JSON response into a JavaScript object. So what we're going to do here inside of the code here now, instead of just logging out the response to the console, on the response, what we want to do is call or invoke the .json method, okay? So what that will do is parse the JSON response into a JavaScript object. And then if I chain on a .then, okay, what we can do is we can just call this data, okay? And then what we're going to do is just log out to the console the data. okay, what we've actually gotten back. And now if I save and refresh, instead of getting this weird looking thing, we're going to get a fact. So we see here, a cat has 230 bones in its body, a human has 206. Okay, so I can't really read it all. Can I bring this across? There we go. There we go. Okay, so the fact is a cat has 230 bones in its body, a human has 206. A cat has no collarbone, so it can fit through any opening the size of its head. Okay, I did not actually know that. By the way, if I refresh the page, our code is going to run again. We're going to send another request, so we might get a different fact. The richest cat is Blackie, who was left £50 million by his owner. Okay, did not know that. Okay, so I'm going to leave that tutorial there. In the next tutorial, we'll talk to this again in more detail. But essentially the key points are, when you're looking to make a request to an API, you can use the inbuilt fetch in JavaScript, okay? You have parentheses, you paste in the URL endpoint that you want to hit, you can chain on a .then, and with the response object, what you can do is call or invoke .json to basically parse that JSON response object into a JavaScript object. Then you chain on another .then method, and this time for the data, you can actually then just log it out to the console. So a bit confusing when you first see it. So I'll see you in the next tutorial, and we'll talk to this again in more detail. Hi everyone, and welcome back. Okay, in the next tutorial we're going to be introducing you to two very important keywords in JavaScript, and they are async and await. But before we introduce new concepts, I just want us to get a bit more practice with sending another or our second GET request to an API. What I'd like you to do is to pause the video and see if you are able to write up code where you can send a GET request to get the latest Bitcoin price. So my hint to you is you can use the CoinDesk API on the website we saw previously. So this one here. So here is the endpoint I want you to use. So really what you can do is just follow the steps, write out the keyword fetch, have your parentheses, have your opening and closing quotes, paste in the API. Then what you can do is chain on a .then to log the response. Make sure you get a status response of 200. If that is the case, you can then chain on the JSON method to parse the JSON response into a JavaScript object. There are actually better ways to make GET requests, which I'll be showing you in the next tutorial, but for now, let's just get a bit more practice with this before we see async and await. So please pause the video and try this challenge yourself. Otherwise, feel free to code along. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to say fetch, and let's just paste in the CoinDesk API here, the API endpoint I should have said. Okay, awesome. Then what we can do is chain on a .then, and what we're going to do is just call the response. So it's a callback function being passed in, and it's going to run, and then just say console.log response. Okay, so now if I just save and refresh, we should hopefully have a 200 response. Okay, so this is good. So we have a status of 200, which means our request has been basically successful. So then what we can do is essentially, instead of logging that out to the console, our response, what we can do, like I say, is on the response, we can call or invoke the JSON method. And what this will do is, this will essentially parse the JSON response into a JavaScript object. And then what we can do, we can chain on a .then, is just on the response. So you could do like so, data. What we're just going to do is just log out the data response that we get. Okay. And what you could do is just maybe put Bitcoin price there in a string beside it if you wanted. So if I just save and refresh, we see here we have gotten a response. Okay. We see here if I open up, we get the latest Bitcoin prices in Euro 39,000, USD 42,000. Okay. So we have gotten a response from the CoinDesk API. So that's pretty cool. Another thing you could do as well if you wanted is you could actually create a button and have an event listener, and when the user clicks on the button, only then does it actually make a request to an API. So that's something you could do as well. So in the next tutorial, I'm going to be showing you how we can actually use async and await to just make our GET requests just a bit more reusable. You don't want to be just making a GET request just randomly in the root of the document. Typically you might do that. You might send a GET request if the user has pressed on a button, they're looking for data, that kind of thing. So this is just a very quick practice. So I'll see you in the next tutorial where we'll see async and await. So I'll see you then. The next tutorial will be a long one, by the way, so get a cup of tea or coffee. Welcome back. In this tutorial, I'm going to show you a better way to make GET requests, and I'm going to introduce you to concepts known as async and await. Async and await are two keywords in JavaScript that we can use. It's a better way because so far in the last two tutorials we saw how we can make a GET request to the cat API, but there's a lot of meta chaining going on, dot then let's do this, and then dot then let's do that, and the same when we made the request to Bitcoin. So I'm going to show you a better way where we're going to avoid multiple dot thens or meta chaining, and we can essentially neatly package our code into a function rather than just randomly making a GET request using fetch in the root of the document. Okay, so first of all, I just want to talk to you about essentially async and await. Okay, so async, the keyword, can be used with a function, and what it will do is essentially it means the function will return a promise. Okay, so when you use the async keyword with a function, that function will return a promise. Okay, so speak about that in a moment. And then what await does is await will stall JavaScript from assigning a value to a variable until that essentially that value is resolved. Okay, so async and await are used together. So we've async and await. So first of all, I'm just going to create a function and just prove to you that when you use async with a function, it will return a promise, even if our code block is empty. So what I can do is I can say const get data. I'm making a get data function, and I'm going to assign this the value of an arrow function like so. Okay, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to use the keyword async on front of the parentheses. So if I say async like so, we have our function called get data. Now, what I can do is I can just essentially call or invoke the get data function and basically just store the data we get back into a variable and log that out to a console. So I'm going to say const data is equal to our get data function, and I'm going to call or invoke the get data function, and then I'm just going to console.log out the data just to see what we get back. Okay, so this is a function. It is an async function. I've used the async keyword there. Let me just refresh. And what you'll notice is we get a promise. Now, it's undefined. There's no code in the function, but the key point is that we get back a promise. So that's the first key learning point from this tutorial, okay? That when you use, let me come down here, sorry. So basically, lesson one is when you use the async keyword with a function, that function will always return a promise. Okay, first thing to note. Okay, so that's great. But now what we want to do is we want to actually write a function that makes a GET request, rather than just an empty function. So this is what we're going to do now. And what we're going to do is we're going to make a quick GET request to the cat API the way we saw previously, and then we're going to refactor our code to the better way. So we saw previously how we can make a request to the API. So we have the fetch keyword, we have our quotes. Oh, I closed down the free APIs. There we go. My internet's a bit slow. I apologize. I should have had this still open. I'm going to code this up pretty quickly, by the way. The last two tutorials explain it. So I'm going to just plow on here a bit quicker than I normally do. So basically what we do is we have our fetch, and we know then that what we can do is we can chain on a dot then, and basically, we have our arrow function in here, and we have a response. Okay, So we saw previously this, we have a response, and we can just log out the response like so, and this will hopefully give us a status 200 if everything works. Okay, so that's awesome. We have our response, okay? But obviously, we don't want to just log out the response to the console. What we can do is on the response, we can basically call or invoke the JSON method, then chain on a dot then, and then what we're going to do is just the data we get back, we will just log this onto the console. Now, the problem with this is there's an awful lot of chaining going on. It's not quite intuitive, really, what's happening. Like there's a dot then, we get a response, we use the .json method to basically make sure we're getting a JavaScript object, and then we're chaining on another dot then. So let's have a look here. So see here, okay, we get our fact, so we've made our call successfully, and that's great. But what I want to do is I just want to show you a better way than that of making a request to an API. So just comment that out for now. So basically what we're going to do is we're going to uncomment out the new way we're going to do it. So we have our const get data equal to async function, but of course there's actually nothing going on inside of the function right now. So what we can do is we can actually paste in fetch, okay, into the function. Okay, so what I'm going to do is just going to come down here. So we're going to, inside of the function, use fetch to make a request to the API. But what we can do is we can actually store the response of this into a variable. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to say const, or you could say let response be equal to fetch the data. Okay, so here is we are basically using fetch to get the data. But what I can then do is on front of fetch, I can use the await keyword. Okay, so what the await keyword does is the await keyword essentially will stall JavaScript from assigning a value to a variable until essentially that response has been resolved, everything is loaded. And this is great because what we can do is we can essentially wait for the get request to occur before we then assign the response into our variable called response here. So this will essentially stall JavaScript from assigning a value, assigning to a variable until everything has essentially resolved. And this is pretty awesome. We saw previously in the first chapter we can assign a value to a variable, let age be equal to 36, let name be equal to Bruce Wayne, etc. But now we're working with APIs and asynchronous data essentially. So we just want to say await. We're saying JavaScript stop, don't assign the value of the response to the response variable until everything has essentially resolved and loaded. Okay, and then what I can do is just console.log response. Okay, so what I'm going to do is I'm just going to delete this, and we're going to call or invoke the getData function. So what's happening here is we've created a function called getData. It is an anonymous arrow function. Oh, sorry, it's not. No, Dara, come on, you're having tea and coffee. Sorry, it's not. It's called getData. I'm going to have a sip of coffee here. Apologies for my error. Okay, let's go again. So I'm so used to when I see this code, I always say inline anonymous arrow function, but we know it's not. It's not inline because there's multiple lines, and of course we've getData. Anyway, enough babbling by me. We have const getData, and we've assigned this the value of an asynchronous function. So we've seen here this syntax before. It's a function that doesn't take any argument. We have our equal sign and chevron. So it's an arrow function. We have our opening and closing brace there, semicolon to end, but we've used the keyword async. So when we enter the code block, what happens is we use fetch, which we've seen before, to make a get request to the catfact.ninja API. And what we're doing is we're just restoring the response. Of course, we're awaiting. We're saying await until there is a response before we assign that response into what we called response, the response variable. And then all we're doing is we're just logging out that response to the console. And then, of course, I call or invoke the getData function, so we actually can make the get request and then log the response out to the console. So now if I save and refresh, we see here we get a response, and we see we have status 200. So that's great. We've definitely got a response from the API, but that's all we've done. so far. So what we want to do now essentially is we want to basically get that response, but then what we can do is use the .json method to basically turn the response into a JavaScript object, and then what we'll do is we'll store that in a variable called data. So now what I'm going to do is, instead of just logging that response out to the console, let's say const data is equal to, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to call upon, on the response that we saw that they're just logged out to the console, we're going to use the .json method, and we know that will return a JavaScript object to us. So what we're doing is we're essentially parsing the JSON response that we got into a JavaScript object. But what we can also do here is use the await keyword. So in other words, on the response, we're telling JavaScript to use the inbuilt JSON method to convert the JSON response into a JavaScript object, but only when that's done. Remember, when we use the await keyword, we are essentially stalling JavaScript from assigning to the variable until everything has occurred. And just a side note, I do think the JSON method is very poorly named, because if you think about it, you're actually converting a JSON response into a JavaScript object. So maybe they could have come up with a better name for that, but it is what it is. And now what we can do is just say console.log data. Okay, so now what we're doing, just to recap, is we've created a function called getData. It is an asynchronous function, so we know when you use the async keyword with a function, the function will always return a promise. Then what we're doing inside of the function is we're using fetch to send a request to the API. We are awaiting that response before assigning that to the response variable. But we know that only gives us, the response in a certain format. We don't yet have access to it as a JavaScript object. So then on this line, what we do is on the response, we call or invoke the JSON method to convert the JSON response to a JavaScript object. We await for that process to occur before assigning the response to the data variable. And then what we're doing is we're just logging out to the console data. So now if I refresh, we see here we get our fact. Okay, so that's awesome. But a better way to do this would be actually to essentially, instead of logging out the data to the console, and our data was, we got a cat fact. Unlike humans, cat cannot detect sweetness, etc. So we have our fact, which is great. But you don't want to actually, because remember, the whole point about this tutorial is we want to make a GET request. We want to neatly package it into a function, but you don't want to log the response out to the console here. You want to actually do something with the data. So logging out the data there is not good enough. What you actually want to do is you want to return the data. Okay, so really what's happening, if you think about it in this function, is three things really. We are, number one, making our GET request to the API. So let me just rewrite out the comments here. So what we're doing is, number one, we are making a GET request. So this line here is where we make our GET request. Then what we do is we assign the response into the response variable. Then what we do here is we use the .json, or sorry, the JSON method. I don't need to say .json. We use JSON, that method, to basically return a JavaScript object. Okay, so the data is actually useful. And then what we're doing then is we are just returning that data. So now when this function is called or invoked, we get a response, and therefore we can actually then use .then on getData. So now when we use the getData call to invoke our getData function, what we can do is we can then say then, and basically what we're going to do is just we're going to get our data back. And here we can just say console.log data. Okay. Have I got a syntax error? Doesn't feel right. Oh, my apologies. That was the wrong one. Okay, awesome. So now what's happening is as follows. We've created our getData function. I've used the async keyword to make this function asynchronous. We know an asynchronous function will return a promise. So when you use the async keyword with a function, that function will always return a promise. Okay. Then what we do is we're using the fetch API to make a request to the cat API, but we're using await. And remember, we know that await will stall JavaScript from assigning a value to a variable. So that's lesson 2. Await will stall JavaScript from assigning a value to a variable until it's all essentially been resolved. So key points about this tutorial are the async and await keywords. Then what we do is after we've gotten our response, we store it in the variable response. But then what we do to avoid, method chaining, like here, response.json.then, etc. We make it much more easier to read here. We simply just, on the response, call or invoke the JSON method. We await that process to occur before storing that in the variable called data, and then we just return the data. Okay, so that's what we've done. And if I just delete all my comments here, so number 1, we make the GET request. Number 2, we use the JSON method to convert to a JavaScript object. And number 3, we essentially return. Okay, what you'll notice is that code we've written here, it's much easier to read than our fetch here, okay? Because it's so neatly packaged away, number 1, into a function, so you don't need to make the GET request in the root of the document the way we have here. You can neatly package it in a function, and this will only run when you call or invoke the function like we did here. And you can see it's just quite easy to read, because you can see very clearly, there's a GET request here. We are awaiting that promise. We're essentially waiting for that response before we store it in the response variable. Then when we have that JSON, what we do is on that response variable, we call or invoke that JSON. We await that process to occur before assigning it to the data variable, and then we simply return the data. Then what we can do, because our function is called getData, we just call or invoke getData. We know that will return a JavaScript object to us, and then we just use .then to just log out the data. And this is a much neater way of doing it than what we did up here. So going to delete that code, and what we see now is this is our entire code to basically make a GET request. And to prove that to you, what we could do is actually basically change our URL endpoint. So if I just paste this URL in now, so we're going to change where we're looking to get data from. So now I'm just going to save. So what's happening? Well, we have a function called getData. It is asynchronous, so we know that will return a promise. What we do is we make a GET request using fetch to the API here, the Coinbase API, to get Bitcoin data. We await for that process to occur. When I say that process to occur, I really mean for the promise to resolve. Okay. Then we store what we get back in the response variable. Then what we do, because we know that's in JSON format, is on response, which is a variable, we then call or invoke the JSON method to basically return us a JavaScript object. We await for that process to occur before we store it in a variable called data, and then what we do is we just simply return data. So then when we call our function, we call or invoke our function getData, we're running all this code up here, we're chaining on only one .then data, and then console.logging the data, okay? So that is essentially, guys, how we can make a GET request using async and await. Key points about async and await. Number 1, the async keyword will make a function asynchronous. So you could have other code occurring up here. This will all run, and then the JavaScript file will continue. We saw that a few tutorials ago, when we use the set timeout. So asynchronous is non-blocking. If you have a load of JavaScript code up here, statements and below, JavaScript will say, okay, this is asynchronous, but I'm going to continue on executing the code underneath it while I'm waiting for all of this to occur. Benefit 2 is it's easy to read. It's quite neatly packaged. So you see here, there's not multiple .thens. It's quite simply, we make a request to the API, we store it in a variable. We then basically use the JSON method to convert the JSON response into a JavaScript object, and we return the data. And we've only used one .then. When we actually call or invoke the function, we see here we can just use the .then method to essentially log the data out. And if I just save and refresh, and we just see our response console, we see here we have a response here from Bitcoin. And if I open up BPI, we see here Bitcoin is now at $43,000 US, just under 40,000 euro. Okay, awesome. I hope you enjoy that tutorial. I encourage you to try make a weather app. So you've got the basics now of how to make requests to an API. Hope you enjoyed that tutorial. I really enjoyed teaching it. That's awesome.